Dr. Mark Troedson and Thomas Mondragon, and they will be speaking to us about a really, really important part of a cutting edge, a growing edge of Jungian theory, which is, as I mentioned in the earlier part of the day, how Jungian theory is taking up, or continuing to take up, the idea of culture and particularly identifying what's being discussed as a cultural complex. So I'll let these guys give you their perspective on that.
Just want to add the one somatic experience to be aware of is post-lunch sleepiness. to maybe differentiate that from analytic sleepiness, which often comes up when people talk about or activate complexes. Complexes can, in Jung's sense, can bring about responses of anger and bring your energy up and extrovert your energy, but it also can put you down. Sometimes the resistance to complexes is sleepiness. Yeah. But maybe it's just after lunch. Or you can blame it on us. So we're going to introduce a little bit. And we talked, Thomas and I talked a little bit this morning about, we were just blown away by all the material that's coming through. And we want to also find a way to invite you and all of us to be able to talk more particularly about the issues of cultural complex. For lots of reasons, it's richer and it's kind of more collaborative. It invites more collaboration. And we're just going to mention a little bit about ourselves first. And so listening this morning in terms of our autobiographies and personality and so on, it was brought to my attention in terms of my personality is so much connected with other people who are already in the room. Of course, students and so on, and some alumni. And I want to welcome alumni friends who are coming back, Bob and Chris, who are Antioch alumni, and who are working, as they graduated from Antioch, have worked with in Jungian institutes, Bob in Chicago, and then Chris in our own institute in Los Angeles, which is a place where I always work, the Los Angeles Institute on Pico. Working to provide Jungian analysis that's really informed all three of us by our Antioch experience. So, we are connected and linked out in the community, willing also, of taking the perspective we're developing here into our community. And I welcome everybody to look at the jungianla.org website to be able to see papers and ways that you can interact with the Jungian community in Los Angeles. And in terms of therapy, getting your internship hours and things like that to enrich that. And I also want to acknowledge brothers and sisters to take somewhat of the Japanese cultural approach that we learned about this morning, to say that Matt and Doug, they probably remember, I know Matt probably does, they are my older brothers in terms of our training. I don't know about chronologically, but older brothers in terms of training, because we were all at Pacifica at the same time. And I remember my first day of PhD program in grad school. Matt and Doug were up and activated. They've mellowed some.
A lot.
A lot. But boy, woo! And my analytic brother Mario, we were in together, and then a sister who's not here but who's really important for the work that Doug's talking about is Sandra Goldman. I don't know if any of you know her, but I always want to acknowledge she was the sister of Mario and mine in our terms of our analytic training at Pacifica, and she invited me here to Antioch, and I remember and honor her. And just finally, I think in terms of in the spirit of the spirit mercurius, I would say that I'm kind of a double agent. That's my personality here, because I'm in the Jungian group, and what that means, and I'm also in the Antioch group. But Jungians can be mercurial. They can have two natures. They can be double agents. And so I find myself being a double agent in many different ways, in many different cultural complexes here. And that's one way that you can be if you're Jungian.
Well, I'm excited to be here. I teach in the S2P specialization and the LGBT specialization, associate faculty, so I feel like I have the best. I really enjoy being in part of both of those. And I'm really kind of excited about talking about the cultural complex today, because what I've really come to see is like it gives us a way to look at some difficult things to talk about in a context that lets us both deal with what's going on outside, but also what's going on inside. And so if I just think about what's going on outside and inside right now for me, besides having just had lunch, the minute I sit up here in front of all of you, I'm immediately feeling my inferiority come up, right? So there's a way in which, you know, in my unconscious fantasy, I'm looking out at you, and you all are sitting there judging me, and you're thinking all kinds of things about me, right? So, you know, I can look at that actually in a couple different ways. One, in the level of a personal complex. So it could be in terms of like my mother complex, my father complex, and projecting that out on me, right? But I'm also sitting here as a gay man who is Japanese and Latino in a room where, you know, I can immediately feel different. And different so often has meant less than, that I'm being looked at negatively or suspiciously, or I have to feel that way in looking out at you, right? So that's the level of the cultural complex that kind of gets activated just by being here, right? So what's exciting is to become more aware of that, so that I don't have to just sit here and believe a fantasy that may not actually be true, but it may be sourced in real trauma that exists in the culture around being a gay man, around heterosexism, around race, and all of that, right? So that, you know, I think there's this dance thing that can start to happen between being curious about my inner life around the more traditional idea of a personal complex, but also how that can interact with the cultural complex. I guess that's all I want to say right now about me. We thought we'd just kind of check in with folks and just see where everybody's at. We just want to just check in. How's it been so far? We're hoping to like open up more as we go along to be able to talk about this. Yeah? Good? Yeah. All right, good. Yeah.
Because there's a kind of, in educational systems, in every system there's hierarchies. So in an educational system there's hierarchies typically where there's the teacher and the student, and I think in terms of depth psychology it's important to be able to sort of invite us to go over those barriers sometimes and get kind of more collaborative. Pedagogy, we talk about pedagogy, and even when Frederick's talking about critical pedagogy, he's still dealing with pedagogy, which gives the hierarchy of like the adult-child thing. So we're the adults,
right.
We're the child, that kind of thing. I think the cultural complex allows us maybe to look at a different kind of resonance in the word culture. And we talked about it a little bit this morning, but I want to amplify a little bit more as we get into defining what the cultural complex is. Culture comes from the Latin, the Roman word of cultivate. So we have agriculture, horticulture, cultivating, growing. In particular, in the early Romans, they talked about cultivating philosophical soul and cultivating soul. So if we think of culture as, of course, we talk about different rules and practices, but also the practice of cultivating one's soul. Then it becomes clearly more connected to therapy, which is attending to one's soul, and cultivating and growing. And it also makes us realize how we can get so, why it's so important, why culture is so important. Because we're not just cultivating some set of theories and principles. We're talking about our souls. We're talking about our personality. We're talking about, in Doug's, the inimitable Doug, the yumminess. We're talking about the yummy things. Yeah. So it's like so there's another image there about cultivating that. So it's an activity. So that's different in terms of setting up an academic culture where we're all cultivating the soul together. And then what's particularly good about, we're talking about the cultural complex, is that we don't have to just find ourselves between our individual personal complex and this collective complex, which is really kind of abstract and ancient, or where is that? There's something closer to where we live, and we live amongst each other in terms of cultural complexes that deal with how we live and interrelate. And so I just want to bring that notion of cultivation, that we cultivate together. I mean, we're all seeding and hoeing and that kind of thing. We want to have some kind of metaphor that we can use as a community to come together and do this work to support each other's development. And so when Thomas talks about the ways that you just did now in terms of the difficulty of you developing as a person and as a plant and so on, then as a farmer, as a cultivator, I want to help cultivate that and nurture that, not as a parent to a child, but as, as a caregiving in that way.
Right. Yeah, so the whole notion of the soul is kind of the central idea around the meaning, right, that we have about ourselves, about life, and all of that. And James Hillman, who's a noted Jungian, he says this about the soul. He says that the study of the soul is a matter of great historical importance. And he says, he once said that the whole world hangs on a thread, and that thread is the human psyche. So in a way, he's kind of referring to the idea that we need to become more psychological about ourselves vis-a-vis what's going on in the world, right? And so that's where having an understanding of what's going on in the culture and in our interaction with different cultures is so important, because without that, that's what creates the difficulties and misunderstandings, the conflicts and all of that. And certainly as therapists, we want to be as aware of that in our work with clients who are different than ourselves, or certainly our own connection to culture, our various cultural pieces. Kind of as an introduction to getting to the definition and what the cultural complex is, I think we're all aware of the importance for Jung around the idea of the shadow, and dealing with all our unconscious material and going into it and having that kind of attitude towards it. And so, when we look at the history of Western civilization, the history of the planet over the past 400 or 500 years, we're all still reeling from the impact of colonization and how Western European ideas and influence just kind of went out in the world and, really took over and decimated cultures and language and rituals and traditions and all of that, right? So, in that sense right there, there's this huge shadow around culture. And so how do we integrate that into the personal aspect of what each person is going through? And that's where the cultural complex comes in. The idea of the complex was, one of the central ideas for Jung as far as the individuation process. And his idea was that we have to make the personal complexes conscious, right? And by doing that, it'll free up the energy that's actually locked up in the personal complex. And we'll get to the definition of that here in a sec, how that's so. And unless we do that, we actually prevent real creative possibility, right? Personally, interpersonally, across cultures, across sexual orientations, gender, and all the different kinds of identities. So briefly, the idea of a complex is it's an emotionally charged group of ideas or images usually formed through conflict or trauma within a person's psyche. So that's kind of the base thing. So all these feelings, these charged feelings, constellate around some traumatic or conflictual event in a person's experience. Right? So one of the things we can often hear about is like a mother complex or a father complex, right? Whatever that, like if I think my relationship to my mother and the mother complex that developed around that, there's a lot of internalized shaming that I have in my mind that came down through my mother and the way she was with me. But what was really amazing and what was so really helpful was Marley's description this morning of the Japanese mother-baby dynamic, right? And if I think about why that created so much conflict and trauma in me is, here, that's part of my dynamic with her, certainly from her history. But I'm being raised in Western culture with a lot of different ideas about what it means to be an individual and have a self and individuate, right? So that has created a lot of, stuff in me that is both, the more object relations type of issue, but also really what comes into play is the cultural piece, the cultural complex around the notion of self and what it means when, like a Japanese idea of the self gets planted here in the West, and what happens, right? So, so we're going to show a short little piece on the cultural complex by, was it Singer or Singer, right?
Tom Singer.
Yeah. There's a book called The Cultural Complex by Thomas Singer and Samuel Kimball's, which is really, really groundbreaking, and he's going to talk, Singer's going to talk 50 minutes about that. There's also a handout that we gave with the characteristics. Did anybody not get one? Okay.